Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today we have two distinguished guests, Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu and former U.S. Secretary of Defense, Dr. Mark Esper. We're here to talk about Taiwan, U.S., China, national security, and of course, Dr. Esper's book, A Sacred Oath, or in Chinese, 一触即发. That's just published a few days ago by TVBS. It's available in all bookstores in Taiwan and can be ordered online from anywhere in the world. Welcome, Minister Wu and Secretary Esper.
Thank you. Glad to be on your show.
I believe you knew each other. Ni hao. I believe you knew each other already. Do you remember your interactions in the past when your government services overlapped? Maybe between 2017 and 2020?
Well, I guess I'll go first. Minister Wu obviously worked in the Foreign Ministry and myself in the Department of Defense. And given the restrictions on U.S. policy with interactions, we frankly didn't have interactions during that time period. Although we discovered later that we have a good many mutual friends in our respective spheres. And of course, I've been working on China-Taiwan policy since the mid-1990s. So my first visit to Taiwan was in the early 2000s. So my experience, my interaction with Taiwanese officials go back many years, but I was really pleased to for the first time meet Joseph Wu after my government service, and have the relationships continued since then and blossomed so that we can have really good discussions about current U.S. policy toward both China and Taiwan.
Well, Mark was right that there were some restrictions over the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Taiwan to interact directly with senior officials in Washington, D.C. But there was a very rare chance for me in 2019 in the Ronald Reagan Defense Forum. And Mark was speaking on the stage, and I was sitting in the audience, and it was only a few meters away. And his speech was impressive, so impressive. He was talking about China and the challenges posed by China on the United States and also on the international community. And later I was interviewed by him and he represented the McCain Institute. And I believe that that interview is still on YouTube. And later he came to Taiwan and we had a wonderful face-to-face chat with each other. And also he called on the president and other very senior officials here in Taiwan. And he cares so much about Taiwan's defense situations, and we have learned quite a lot from him in that face-to-face discussions.
Well, it says how difficult it is for senior officials to actually interact with each other between Taiwan and U.S. But thank you for, especially, Secretary Esper, for your willingness and trying in the past. And you were last in Taiwan about just a year ago. During your trip, you actually gave advice to President Tsai that Taiwan should dramatically increase Taiwan's defense budget and lengthen military conscription for at least 1 year for both men and women, and stockpile food and weapons. And last August, President Tsai announced a nearly 15% increase in the defense budget from 2022. In December, she also announced that starting in 2024, the 1-year mandatory military service will be reinstated. So it looks like she's heeded to your advice. Now, is Taiwan doing enough from your point of view?
Well, let me first say thank you to Joseph Wu for his kind words. Taiwan and the Taiwanese people are blessed to have such a capable foreign minister. And so I just want to thank him for that. Look, yes, you're right. I was in Taiwan last summer just before Speaker Pelosi arrived. And, I gave my advice, if you will, to President Tsai. I think she's done a very great job. She's been quite capable. I think the decision to extend conscription up to a year was a courageous decision. But I wasn't the only voice. There are others out there who are saying the same things. I think my approach is to look at this from the lens of both Taipei and Washington. And Washington has made a commitment to Taiwan, going all the way back to the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979. And my view is, if you want to also move beyond an agreement that's embraced in law through policy, but also garner the full support of the American people, then I think Taiwan should do everything that it can as well to show that Taiwan and the Taiwanese people are committed to their own self-defense as well. And that includes doing things that require sacrifice. And sacrifice means, young people serving their military. That means increasing defense spending up to, pretty significant amount given the threats you face, and doing a number of other things that take bold political decisions. And that is what I was recommending and what President Tsai and her cabinet have taken on, again, with great political courage. So I give her credit for what she's done. There's obviously more that can always be done in the United States as well, but I think we're on a much better path today.
Now, I'm going to turn this to Minister Wu then, since this has become a more controversial issue. The KMT presidential candidate Hou You-yi just pledged to reverse the conscription length back to 4 months if he is elected. And once the cross-strait relations are stabilized, however, that's defined. So how has this conversation been going on in Taiwan?
Well, I think Mayor Hou made that remark, but he knew that he's running into a lot of opposition from the Taiwanese people, and also some concerns from the international community, especially from the United States. He quickly readdressed his way of speaking about the conscription, and he put some serious conditions on shortening the conscripts. But I think from Taiwan's perspective, we have to be very realistic about the threat we have been receiving from the other side of the Taiwan Strait, especially the military threat. And if we want some other countries to give us necessary support, we cannot just sit idle and ask other countries to provide support to Taiwan. I have some friends who used to serve in the Defense Department, and they told me in a very frank way, we cannot help you more than you can help yourself, or you want to help yourself. If Taiwan is not willing to do any sacrifice, and at the same time, we are not entitled to ask any country to sacrifice for Taiwan. So that is something that is, we have to take it. And when China is increasing its military threat, we have to think about ways to increase our defense capabilities, and lengthening the conscript period is just one of them.
So I think obviously Mayor Hou said that because there was clear support domestically for his position. And so now turning to Secretary Esper, would this be a concern to the United States should the mandatory military service be shortened again in Taiwan?
Yes, absolutely, because it sends all the wrong signals to the United States and to Taiwan's other supporters around the world. I mean, what's inspired the United States to support Ukraine has been, first of all, the leadership of President Zelensky, and secondly, the willingness of the Ukrainian people, men and women, to pick up arms and fight for their country. And I think for Taiwan to go in the opposite direction would send the wrong signal, and it really questions the resolve of people in Taiwan. The American people ask themselves, well, why should I send our sons and daughters to fight if Taiwanese boys and girls won't fight for their own country? So again, I hate to speak in such stark terms, but that's how people view it. And I think Joseph Wu has just made the same statement, that you have to show that Taiwan is committed to its own defense as well. And I know these are tough decisions, and I know politicians tend to play toward what is popular. And I'm not taking a position in domestic politics. I'm just saying what I think the impact has on other countries that will support Taiwan. Look, we also looked at countries like Finland, who recently joined NATO, and we see a country that has mandatory conscription. 80% of young men serve. They attend military drills every year, and they're a much, much smaller country than Finland is compared to Russia, than Taiwan is to China. So we look to those countries and we get inspired, and it motivates the United States and other Western democracies to defend another fellow young democracy. So I think it's the signaling which is more important than anything else in this regard.
Well, I think ultimately there's some voice in Taiwan that questions whether deterrence or a stronger defense is actually a better strategy for Taiwan. So this is a question to both of you, obviously. Is deterrence or a better relationship with Beijing safer for Taiwan? Maybe
Yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
Both. Right. I think a strong deterrent actually is a basis for a good relationship or a better relationship with China. Look, authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, they see weakness, they perceive it as a vulnerability to exploit. I think if Taiwan builds up its capabilities, its stockpiles, and commits more to defense, it builds up a stronger alliance network, if you will, which includes the United States, Japan, and others, then I think it gives it a better position at the negotiation table, or I should say in cross-strait relations with Beijing. And the two are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I would argue again that I think an enhanced deterrence capability built on a strong defense, built on a signal of resolve from Taipei and from the Taiwanese people, actually positions you better to have improved relations with Beijing, and certainly again with other allies and partners in the region.
Mr. Wu?
I agree absolutely. I think the policies being pursued by Taiwan have two basic elements. The first one is that we don't want to provoke China. And as you hear from President Tsai or other senior officials from Taiwan, we want to maintain the status quo across the Taiwan Strait, and we want to maintain peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait. And we also want to be able to speak with the Chinese if they do not have those preconditions on us. And this is a very basic way of keeping China from thinking that they can have any excuse to launch a war against Taiwan. But on the other hand, I think the best and most effective way of preventing China from thinking that they can launch a war against Taiwan and they can take Taiwan over very quickly is that Taiwan has a very strong defense capabilities. And this is the direction President Tsai is heading. We are making more investment in our defense. We are transforming our strategy into asymmetric. And we are also training our soldiers for the new capabilities. We are buying more weapons for our self-defense capabilities. And all these kinds of combinations is going to serve as a very strong deterrence against the Chinese ambition of launching a war against Taiwan. But at the same time, we are also seeing international players like the United States, Japan, and other major democracies are also taking precautions against the Chinese ambition in this area. For example, they continue to tell the Chinese that peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait is very important. And they continue to urge the Chinese not to engage in unilateral change of status quo across the Taiwan Strait. And they're also mentioning to China that any kind of impact upon the Taiwan Strait peace and stability is going to have a major global effect. And all these are going to be a very strong deterrence against the Chinese.
Well, thank you. I think there's a line between what is viewed as deterrence and provocation, right? So the question goes to Minister Wu again. Taiwan is the one to bear the consequences should Washington, D.C. is perceived by China to change its long-held Taiwan policy. So how does Taiwan balance this delicate relationship? Well, you know, on one hand, you need strong support, defense, obviously, but on the other, you don't want to be viewed as you're provoking Beijing. So how do you balance these two?
Well, this is not easy, but I think President Tsai has been doing a great job in balancing all different kinds of considerations for not provoking China. We understand that there are things that we need to be very careful, especially when it comes to the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. And there's a very serious commitment by President Tsai and the Tsai administration on maintaining the status quo, safeguarding the status quo. And this policy has won the admiration and appreciation from our friends around the world, especially the United States. But on the other hand, we also need to think about the Chinese motivations and their objectives over Taiwan. They are hoping to be able to crush Taiwan without the actual use of force, or they want to overwhelm Taiwan when they launch war against Taiwan. So they don't want Taiwan to have any friends. They don't want Taiwan to arm itself, and they don't want Taiwan to be active on the international stage. But for Taiwan, when China is trying to isolate Taiwan, the necessary thing is for Taiwan to build our friendship, with the international community. And in the last few years, because we have been speaking with the international community about the situation over the Taiwan Strait, we are getting more support from the United States, getting more support from European countries, from Canada, from Australia, and from Japan. And all these are very important elements of deterrence against China. But at the same time, these should not be considered as provocation, because these are just building friendship.
Well, I think Minister Wu said a very important sentence, which is status quo, which is a popular, I would say, language by all sides, right? However, I mean, this is a question for Dr. Esper. You've said that the U.S. should not be self-deterred and that Washington, D.C. should review its one China policy and strategic ambiguity policy toward Taiwan. Is that a change of status quo? And do you really think China will not make a move toward Taiwan with those changes?
Well, I think longstanding United States policy has been to not provoke China with regard to one China policy. In fact, the policy speaks to no unilateral changes in the status quo, right, through military means. But the status quo, frankly, has changed, and Beijing has changed it. And so when I speak to the need to review the one China policy and to remove strategic ambiguity, it's because of what Beijing has done over the past 40 years, or at least certainly since the Taiwan Relations Act was passed in 1979. The TRA says that the United States would maintain or provide Taiwan with the arms and assistance it needs to defend itself. But if you look at the balance of power in the last 40 years, between Taiwan and Beijing, it's become very lopsided. Beijing has a much larger and more capable military force for obvious reasons, right? The size of its economy, country, so forth and so on. So the balance of power in the Taiwan Strait has changed, and China has unilaterally changed it. And just look at the provocative actions by Beijing over the past 40 years. I mean, just last week, you had dozens of crossings of the median line by Chinese military aircraft. You have over a dozen ships off of Taiwanese waters. That didn't happen 40 years ago. That didn't happen 30 years ago. It didn't happen 20 or 10 years ago. But now it is the status quo because Beijing has changed it and is being provocative. And so that's why I've argued that I think we need to take a look at our one China policy and make sure it's sufficient for the time. At the time of the opening of the time of the passage of the Taiwan Relations Act, Taipei also made claims on the mainland. That's not the case anymore. There are aspirations to do other things. So I think so much has changed that it is time to update our policy as well. And I think less strategic ambiguity would send a better and more deterrent signal to Beijing about American willingness to support Taiwan if it is attacked unprovoked by Beijing. So that's kind of a short history, which you both know better than I do. But my view has been that China has been the aggressor here, not Taiwan and not the United States.
Well, clearly, people define, what's been changed differently. And so I think, the question for Minister Wu related to this was last year, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi decided to visit Taiwan. I'm sure it's related to this idea that Taiwan needs more reassurance of U.S. security guarantee. So it requires a lot of wisdom and creative thinking when it comes to this kind of situation, senior level officials visiting each other. What were the communications like with the Biden administration as well as the speaker's offices, to the extent that you can share?
Well, thank you very much for this question. We stay in very close touch with the Biden administration. In fact, in my experience, in communicating with the administration in Washington, D.C., we are staying in closer communication than in any other period of time. And I think that is because the Chinese have ramped up its military threat against Taiwan, engaged in economic coercion, and also engaged in hybrid warfare against Taiwan. And I think in order to prevent war from taking place, or for Taiwan and the United States to work closer with each other, those kinds of communications are absolutely necessary. And when you mention about Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, we are also in close touch with her office. In fact, we have been in close touch with all the congressional leaders in Washington, D.C., and we are supported by both sides of the aisle, and this is something that we feel very proud of. And in order for Taiwan to get the support from the United States, that kind of communication is absolutely necessary. And for Speaker Pelosi to visit Taiwan and to show her support for Taiwan, that is highly welcomed by the Taiwanese government and the Taiwanese people. I don't know whether anyone over here has noticed, but when Speaker Pelosi was here in Taiwan, there were a lot of people on the street side showing up the sign says that we love you, Speaker Pelosi. And that is coming from their spontaneous way of showing appreciation. Taiwan has been isolated by China, and the Chinese objective is continue to isolate Taiwan. But to Taiwan, for us to, in order for us to be able to fight against the Chinese attempt to isolate us, we need friends. So anyone who wants to come and show support to Taiwan will be welcome, whether it's Speaker Pelosi or Senate President Vice or any other congressional leader. Support for Taiwan is natural, but it's only the Chinese way of threatening Taiwan that would attract more people who want to come to Taiwan and show their support.
I think that was, while, you know, Speaker Pelosi was widely popular and well received in Taiwan, a lot of people in Washington, D.C., as well as in other parts of the world, were quite worried about that moment. And I think, you know, Secretary Esper, you actually supported Speaker Pelosi's visit. And, you know, the question is, you know, not so much about that moment, but more what communication has been done, right? So I know you already left the government, but just curious, did you think, you know, the military to military conversation, for example, between US and China happened or not? Because in your book, you also mentioned a very risky moment right before US presidential election, how you tried to reach out to your counterpart in the Chinese military department to make sure there's no miscommunication. It really highlights just, you know, the importance to not to have any incident. So what is your view now that, you know, US-China, there's no military to military communication? Are we at a dangerous moment again?
Well, first, let me speak to Speaker Pelosi's visit. First of all, it was not unprecedented, of course. Speaker Gingrich went there in the mid-90s, and yet when Pelosi visited late last year, China, again, completely tried to change the situation and make it into much more than it was. And I think Speaker Pelosi wanted to visit because she felt strongly about human rights. She felt strongly about United States support for Taiwan. And my view was, from a government perspective, is the United States should not be deterred by statements coming out of Beijing. And if you back down and allow Beijing to dictate where and when our officials travel, then that's just kowtowing to them, and that sends all the wrong signals. So I think Speaker Pelosi did the right thing and handled the situation well, and everything worked out. Now, a year later, of course, Speaker McCarthy was considering a visit, and I think President Tsai played it very well. And rather than McCarthy going to Taiwan, which was in a much more heated moment between the U.S. and China, she traveled to the United States. And I think it was, again, a very deft way of handling the situation. With regard to my book, and I've talked about many of these issues in the book. I have a whole chapter on China, and I speak about Taiwan and Taiwan policy. But I was concerned in October of 2020, as we were preparing for exercises in Asia, with Japan, that at a very uncertain time when China was concerned about what the United States may do. They were unsure about our exercises. If you recall, Xi Jinping was speaking to his military. He was telling them to be prepared. What I wanted to avoid was any type of accident or incident or mishap or misunderstanding. And so I kind of sent a message to my leadership: just steady as she goes, do nothing abnormal one way or the other. And we pushed back an exercise for a few days to avoid the timing of a U.S. general election. I had a good relationship, I thought, with the Chinese defense minister at the time. I worked to meet with him every quarter or so to discuss issues in person or by Zoom like this. because I thought it was important to have a communication line to understand one another. And I still believe that to be the case. Here we are, though, in 2023, and Secretary of Defense Austin has not spoken for quite some time with his counterpart. I think part of it is Chinese posturing. There are problems with the United States sanctioning the general. On one hand, problems going back to the balloon incident, other issues. And I think this is more China kind of playing politics between Washington and Beijing. I do think there needs to be a relationship between the two. I think communications are important. That said, I would not be going back and forth with Beijing, begging, pleading, if you will, for I'm not saying that we're doing this, but it could come across that we're so desperate to have a meeting that it conveys weakness. And that's something you cannot do with Beijing. So I think we need to keep working on it, rebuild the lines of communication, because I think those are important.
Well, let me say a few words in addition to what Mark just said. I think he's absolutely right. In addition, I think we also need to look at Beijing's strategy. I think Beijing's strategy, especially over Taiwan, is that they want to say that this is provocative and that is provocative, and you cannot do this and you cannot do that. And if we accept what Beijing has been saying to Taiwan, I think Taiwan might as well surrender. But that's not going to happen. I think the right thing for all of us to do is when we think that something is right, we need to continue to do it. And we cannot let Beijing dictate our terms, like how Taiwan make friends or how Taiwan is building up its defense capabilities.
Again, I'll further that, and by saying what Beijing's been doing the last year, at least since Pelosi's visit, with increased crossings of the median line, warships off the waters of Taiwan. All they're doing is slicing away at the standards, at the bars by which we protect and Taiwan safeguards its sovereignty. I think the United States and its friends in the region should match that, should challenge the Taiwan with our own deployments, our own exercises, our own increased training, so that the Chinese realize that the more they pick this up, the more we will assist and not back down. And I don't think we've sent a strong enough signal to Beijing when it comes to those types of actions on our part.
Agree, and I think I might want to say a few more words than what Mark just commented. Beijing has been trying to change the status quo unilaterally over the Taiwan Strait. They've been flying over the median line of the Taiwan Strait, which has been safeguarding the status quo and peace and stability over the last few decades. And it's not just the Taiwan Strait. Beijing has also been trying to change the status quo over the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And Beijing has also been trying to change the status quo in the Pacific. And Beijing has also been trying to set up its ports for future naval operations along the Indian Ocean. And I think that requires our attention. And for us to be able to deal with that, I think all democracies need to work with each other to prevent Beijing from changing unilaterally changing the status quo in different parts of the world.
Well, it's good to see that Taiwan is working closely with the U.S. and some other allies to strengthen the defense. But diversification of strategy is also important. So this is for Minister Wu. Is Taiwan having other hedging strategies?
We've been trying to build up friendship with many other democracies. And I should say that our relations with major democracies have been improving tremendously in the last couple of years.
You were just in Europe, right? You were just in Europe a few weeks ago.
That's right. I was just in Europe. Our relations with major European countries, with the UK, with Canada, with Australia, with Japan, have also been tremendously improving. And if you listen to the statements coming out of these capitals or their summits, G7 summits, or all kinds of 2+2 meetings, they all come up with a standard phrase that it is very important to maintain peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait. And they also oppose unilateral change of status quo over the Taiwan Strait. And they recently have been saying that peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait is a very important matter to the global security and prosperity. And I think this is very important to look at Taiwan's strategic position. Taiwan is a major democracy, and it's also a powerhouse for semiconductor production. And this is also a major international shipping route through Taiwan Strait. And if all these are being disrupted, I think it's going to have a major impact upon the global community. And because of this repeated explanation to the members of the democracies, now I think there's a common understanding that rendering friendship and support to Taiwan is a good thing. And we are hearing all these kinds of support now.
Well, I think I'm glad that you mentioned Taiwan's semiconductor industry, because I think, Taiwan's strategic importance is more than defense and security, or defense in another way. And so, however, it has become a double-edged sword for Taiwan's leading chip manufacturing companies. That's why we're seeing TSMC, investing in Arizona in the United States. That's also become a debate domestically in Taiwan. So I guess the question is diversification of semiconductor manufacturing safer or better for Taiwan?
Well, from our perspective, Taiwan has built this cluster or ecosystem of semiconductor industry in the last 4 decades. And now this is where we are. We produce about 60% of the global total output of semiconductor chips and about 92% of the most advanced semiconductor chips. And this is the kinds of situation that it's very hard for any one country to replace. And the investment from the TSMC in Arizona or in Japan, Kumamoto, Japan. I think this is the way the TSMC is trying to expand its global operation in cooperation with its major partners, either in the United States or in Japan. And I heard that some semiconductor companies here in Taiwan are also thinking about entering into cooperation with European countries. And all this is the diversification of Taiwan's strengths, and diversification in the sense that Taiwan is extending more of its semiconductor influence over the global community. But the main production and the research and development at the highest end of the production will remain in Taiwan. I have no doubt about it. And therefore, making more investment in other countries actually is a good thing for Taiwan's semiconductor industry. And I should also say that because of the semiconductor production here in Taiwan, the international community now understand the kinds of impact that the world will have if China launches war against Taiwan and the supply chain is disrupted. And I think this kind of awareness is good for Taiwan to be able to persuade other countries that come and work together with Taiwan is a good thing. And I have the data in my hands. For example, for last year, we had a 77.9% of investment increase here in Taiwan from the international community. And I think that is because the international community understand the strengths of Taiwan and the attractiveness of Taiwan market. And with the international investment coming into Taiwan, I think Taiwan is made safer than before.
Well, then I'm going to ask Dr. Esper, because clearly, the diversification of semiconductor manufacturing capability in the world is one big concern for the Biden administration. And so you see the administration's technology export control and other restrictive investment policies in the name of national security. And in your view, this is quite some government intervention. And so the question is this actually going to slow down or actually accelerate China's technology advancement?
Sure, it's a good question. Let me go back a couple steps on and talk to your first question about the diversity. I think Taiwan's is doing a great job diversifying its relationships. It's been enabled certainly by Xi Jinping's rise and China's bad behavior, so much so that I think a very important moment that people in the West often miss is the fact that Japan has moved markedly in a very positive way with regard to its view on China and its concerns about Taiwan. And if you look to Europe, you'll see Germany, which is really surprising, also making similar moves. NATO just came out of its summit with a very strong statement about China. So you see Europe moving as well. On the diversification front, and I'll get to your answer, on the diversification front, I also think it's important, I've been saying this publicly, that the United States can conclude a trade agreement with Taiwan this year, and we should also have a tax and investment agreement as well. I think doing that will help strengthen the economic ties between our countries, and then send the right signals to other Western allies to also conclude similar types of agreements with Taiwan, which would allow Taiwan to, again, diversify its economy, pull back some of the investment from China itself, and then be in a stronger position internationally. Now, this gets us down to the semiconductor piece. Look, I clearly, the United States restrictions on technology going to China is about national security, but it's also about economic security as well. You know, semiconductors, chips, if you will, are going to be the lifeblood of today's economy, of our economic prosperity, our national security, and our way of life. And I think we cannot allow that to be at risk. I think that's part of the diversification scheme, but we also cannot allow China to have access to those advanced high technology items, chips, that will allow them to fuel their industries and their military. Look, they got the largest military in the world right now, and it's getting better and better. That's one concern. At the same time, they have a strategic plan to dominate certain industries, aviation, telecommunications, biotech, you name it. And we cannot allow China to win that race. And we cannot allow an authoritarian regime to dominate these key industries, because we will all suffer as a result. So I think what the Biden administration is doing, it's a continuation, frankly, of the Trump administration policies when it comes to controls on chips. They've taken a step further. It needs to be multilateral, but I think it's all a good thing when it comes to protecting ourselves.
Well, since you mentioned the Trump administration, a lot of Taiwanese people actually liked President Trump and the administration's Indo-Pacific policy. They credited President Trump for being tougher on China and being more supportive of Taiwan. But in your book, you highlighted the danger of President Trump as the US president and his lack of respect for the professional decision-making process in the US government. So can you say a little bit more to our audience?
Yeah, let's focus on the China issue, because I think, and I write about this extensively in my book, I think an important achievement of the Trump administration is the fact that we consolidated a view, certainly within the United States government and arguably within the country, that China is certainly a strategic competitor. I argue that they are an adversary, and that we needed a completely different approach, that continuing to engage the way we was just not fruitful. It was being used against us. I give a lot of credit, not to Donald Trump personally in this regard. I think it was a well-crafted policy by his national security advisor at the time, H.R. McMaster, and that was further developed by his cabinet. You know, DOD, the Defense Department that I ran, my top priority was implementing a national defense strategy that focused on China, and certainly others like Mike Pompeo at State. My concern with Donald Trump was that he never fully embraced that strategy. With regard to the United States position on China. He was really focused on two things: the trade agenda, and specifically putting tariffs on China, and secondly, his personal relationship with Xi Jinping. And it's actually the latter that concerned me. Donald Trump, frankly, didn't get tough on China until COVID hit the United States really hard in the spring of 2020, and that we had every reason to believe that China was behind it, certainly not providing information to help us deal with the pandemic. The global pandemic. So my concern with Donald Trump was more that he valued his relationship with Xi Jinping more than he did implementing, I thought, was a really robust, comprehensive strategy to deal with China and to support friends like Taiwan.
Well, since President Trump is running again, are you worried? And what would be your advice to foreign governments, including Taiwan, should there be another Trump administration? And will you join?
Well, no, I won't join. I don't think Donald Trump is fit to be president for any number of reasons. First of all, I think he puts himself first, and I think any leader, whether it's the president of Taiwan, the president of the United States, you name it, has to put the country first, the people first, and that's not Donald Trump's inclination. In this case, you know, I don't think Donald Trump values alliances and partnerships the way myself and other traditional Republicans, and I describe myself as a Reagan Republican. Ronald Reagan believed strongly in allies and partners and defending democracy and human rights. That's not where Donald Trump comes from. So my concern would be that in a second administration, Trump administration, after learning lessons in his first go around, that he would ultimately work to pull ourselves out of NATO, pull U.S. forces out of Korea or Japan, and maybe weaken the relationship with Taiwan. All those things would be bad, certainly for Taiwan, but also for the United States national security and for international stability writ large.
Well, then, so the last question would be for Minister Wu. So, it wasn't easy to deal with any government with such uncertainty. So how did Taiwan actually evaluate and manage that relationship, especially towards the end of the Trump administration? And should there be another Trump administration, what would be Taiwan's sort of contingency plan or strategy?
Well, we did not work with President Trump directly, except for that phone call before he took office. And of course, that was the initial contact. But when President Trump was in office, we worked primarily with those officials in the administration, in the Defense Department, in the State Department, and also in the National Security Council. And all these very nice and very helpful officials helped elevate Taiwan's relations with the United States. So we owe a lot to those officials who served in the Trump administration. And our relations with the United States is that we try to build friendship with both parties. And on the Capitol Hill, we got tremendous support from both sides of the aisle. In fact, the visiting congressman continued to tell us that the United States is being seriously divided, especially in the Congress. But when it comes to Taiwan, they are united. So we are very happy to work with both parties on the Capitol Hill. And in the administration, we have a long relationship with the White House, the National Security Council, the Defense Department, and the State Department. And no matter who is in office, even though they might have a different style, and I think the support will remain the same. And we are confident that no matter who is becoming the new president of the United States, we will continue to enjoy very solid relations with the United States.
Well, I think same reason why, Dr. Esper is still very much involved in Taiwan-related issues, even though he's left the government. So thank you, Minister Wu and Dr. Esper, for speaking to TVBS Meeting Room. We hope to promote better understanding between U.S. and Taiwan, and starting with Dr. Esper's book, 一触即发. Thank you and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.